I'll be curious. How at this point, how seemingly coached up will Lenoris and Nick be on not giving us any details on this offense versus, oh, that's interesting. They're not going to give us much, right? But do they give us enough for us to overreact on? You know what I mean? Like, do they give us enough to chew on? Like, that's a little interesting tidbit. I feel like, man, they were very, very quiet about this scheme in the spring. Obviously, that's by design, but sometimes you see kind of just the typical, they're just not giving much away, but you still get little tidbits. I feel like it was a concerted effort to be not too specific at all about this offensive scheme. So do we have to wait until September 5th to really get a glimpse at what that is? Or are we going to be able to start to get some details? Because here's the thing, and it's going to sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but I promise I'm not. I'll go into it. This offense, there are certain things about this offense that have been in play wherever Kendall Briles has been. But there are certainly aspects of his offenses that have been completely changed and molded to where he was at and the personnel he had. Or, frankly, you look at the 3 years at TCU, his head coach. Like, I think when you go into a situation where your head coach is known as a little bit more of a passer of the football and has his own offensive scheme ideas, you're frankly kind of having to probably mold what you're doing to what he likes as much as anything. Plus, Josh Hoover, as we've talked about, man, very different quarterback skill set than KJ Jefferson, for example. So you can go back to, when Kendall Briles was with his dad at Baylor, the various different skill sets of quarterbacks that they had in a row. And this was when they were like one of the only teams doing kind of I guess people call it the wide choice now, where you're just spreading everybody sideline to sideline and then ripping them apart. Now you see that a little bit more, right? So I'll be curious to see, does this, Chris, look like Tennessee's offense, for example, with Josh Heupel? Because that's the same DNA as what Briles comes from, right? Same tree. Does it look similar again, but does it look a little bit more like sort of what Kiffin has morphed into? Does it look more like the Arkansas offense under Kendall Briles? Does it look like the TCU offense under Kendall Briles? All those things have overlap, but all those offenses are very different approaches if you really dive into them, I feel like.
Well, and Kendall Briles, obviously had a chance to dive into this team and actually be in the meeting rooms with them, building a relationship with Sellers, figuring out what he can do, seeing it. And that's a little bit different than even just, hey, I watched a bunch of film on South Carolina. Here's kind of my takeaways. Here's where I think we can take this thing. Then you get into spring practice. You have 15 practices and you go through and you're going to have maybe a different sense. It might be the same, might be different. And you're going to try to cater it into what your skill set actually can do for you. Again, every offensive coordinator out there is going to say, yeah, we're going to mold our offense to what our players can do, but some are better than others. And one thing you can say about Kendall Briles, there's a couple things. Number one, he has a system, but he's shown, not just said in a press conference, he's shown that it has adapted based on personnel. He's had offenses that have put up huge passing numbers. He's had offenses that have put up huge numbers on the ground. Now, you'd love to be both, right? But ultimately, you're probably going to look at, okay, what does that team really, really do well? And a huge point of emphasis, of course, for South Carolina, above all else, is going to be trying to run the football because they have not been consistent or effective at that over time. So that's the biggest thing you can say about Kendall Briles is that he's actually adjusted his offense. And so I also think you look at last season, there's really one thing last year that South Carolina did well, and you might roll your eyes and say they didn't do anything well. Actually, statistically, they were pretty good at explosive plays through the air, right? So if you're Kendall Browse, you're thinking, all right, we got to find a way to build in the Nick Harbor deep ball into this offense and keep some of those explosive elements. But you also have to be much, much better at not being in those long downs and distances. You got to be much better at running the football. And so his offense is going to give you some advantages in trying to do that. The tempo, getting the ball out quicker, making things a little bit easier on 16 and that receiving core, and taking pressure off the offensive line. But I'm with you. I'm curious as to what ultimately does that look like when we watch the offense. And we still, we'll know it, I think when we get into the season, but we don't have a great answer just yet to that question.
Well, and I think too, man, when you talk about molding an offense to the ability of your players and your quarterback and all that, for some quarterbacks, that sort of circle is kind of small of things they can do and do well. With other quarterbacks, I think you look at a guy like Lenora Sellers in terms of what he can physically do. Like that's still a pretty massive array of things you could do with him. So I think even then there's a little bit of it may actually, Chris, be easier if a guy is like limited to certain things to be like, okay, these are the things we're going to do because this is what we have to do. With Sellers, it's like, well, do you just lean into the fact that he can create a car wreck as a runner and just smash people, but then you worry about the physicality stacking on your quarterback as a year goes. Do you say, hey, he's such a good deep ball thrower, we're going to lean into this vertical passing game? There are pros and cons of that. Are you able to protect it long enough to do that consistently? So I think there's a lot of different ways Kendall Briles and company could take that, even if it's in the thought process of building it around, these players. I think, dude, if you just look, though, at some of the stuff they did going all the way back to Baylor, the idea of putting someone like Nick Harbor just from a forcing defenses to defend the entire field, if you spread him out as far as you possibly can, and then you're forcing people to account for the run game with Lenora Sellers in the box, the vertical passing game of Nick Harbor split all the way out. Like, I think there's a lot of different things you could do with that to really that aren't even really that complicated from an offensive standpoint, but are complicated from a defensive standpoint in your decision making. Like, I think it's going to limit what defenses are able to call defensively, and it's just going to be a matter of being able to execute it at that point, get good enough protection up front, and go from there. But from a skill standpoint at quarterback and receiver, he's going to have a lot to work with. But I've been diving into some of the stuff at TCU. There was actually quite a bit of two tight end, quite a bit of shifts and motions pre-snap, which shifts and motion pre-snap is the complete opposite of up tempo. You know what I'm saying? Like you can do both as an offense, but you can't do both on the same play. Like you're kind of doing one or the other. So I do think as much as tempo will be a part of this, Chris, one thing we've heard, they're still going to huddle up at times. They're still going to be pre-snap shifts, motions. They're still going to take advantage of the ability to now have contact with the comms with your quarterback if you huddle up and slow things down a little bit. So how do they mix the tempos? I think is like another layer to this.
Yeah, it's a great, and you look back at Briles again. I mean, we've been talking about it the whole time. There's just so many different things that they can do that they have done, in the past. I think this is something that's not this overly analytical point, but one thing that I've noticed about Kendall Briles and that we've been told is I think he's just very comfortable as an OC. We don't know the structure of the offense. At some point, we're going to be able to go back and look, all right, South Carolina's played the regular season. Here's how often they went tempo. Here's how often they were in this formation. And you'll be able to glean all that information. And so we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But what we do know is he has a system, right? He's got an offensive line coaches, and Randy Clements and Jason Smith, his top assistant, that have all been together in this system for a long time. So while you're not sure structurally or schematically exactly how it's going to come out, you're not sure percentage wise how much tempo there's going to be, you do know that there is a system, and there's a proven system. And frankly, we've wondered about that. Remember how many times we've gone into a season saying, I don't know, what is South Carolina's offense? We don't really know. There's actually a system that's this time around that's been molded to the players. And I think just from what we've heard, early indications, maybe not early at this point, they've been through spring ball, they're in the summer now. Lenore Sellers seems to have gained some confidence back relative to last season, which I think is incredibly important with him being the trigger man of this offense.